familiar click, a sound that marked the end of another long day. I pushed the door open and stepped into my small apartment, dropping my bag by the entrance with a sigh. 8 hours staring at a computer screen in the office, followed by a crowded bus ride home. It was the same routine, day after day. My shoulders ached, and my eyes felt dry from the fluorescent lights. I kicked off my shoes and walked straight to the sofa, collapsing onto the cushions. My apartment was neat, maybe too neat. Everything had its place. It was my small attempt to control something in a life that felt increasingly like it was just happening to me. I pulled out my phone, the screen lighting up my tired face. Scrolling through social media felt automatic, a way to numb the vague sense of dissatisfaction that often crept in during these quiet evening hours. Pictures of friends travelling, celebrating promotions, starting families. It all seemed so vibrant compared to my predictable cycle of work, commute, sleep, repeat. Was this really it? I dreamed of doing something more creative, something with more meaning, but the practical voice in my head always shut it down. Pay the bills, Maya. Stay responsible. Don't rock the boat. Just as I was about to drift into another mindless hour of scrolling, my phone vibrated with an incoming call. Mom. I hesitated. I loved my mother, Sarah, but sometimes her calls felt like gentle reminders of things I hadn't done yet. Still, ignoring her would only lead to worried follow-up calls. I tapped the screen to answer. Hi, Mum, I said, trying to sound less exhausted than I felt. Maya, dear, how was your day? Her voice was warm as always. Oh, fine. Busy, I replied, keeping it brief. Good. Listen, honey, I was just thinking. Do you remember that box from Grandma Eleanor's house? My stomach tightened slightly. I knew exactly which box she meant. After my grandmother passed away 6 months ago, Mum had carefully packed up some of hers personal belongings. There wasn't much. Grandma Eleanor had lived simply. But one cardboard box, filled with items deemed too personal to donate immediately, had ended up stored in my tiny hall closet. I'd promised Mum I'd sort through it eventually. Eventually hadn't arrived yet. Yeah, Mum, I remember, I said slowly. Well, she continued gently, I know you're busy, dear, but it's been a while. I thought maybe this weekend, it would be good to see what's there. Your grandmother kept things carefully. I leaned my head back against the sofa. The last thing I wanted to do this weekend was sift through dusty memories. It felt like another chore on top of an already full plate. Mum, I'm really tired lately. Can it wait a bit longer? There was a soft sigh on the other end. I understand, Maya, but sometimes looking back helps us move forward. Please just take a look when you have a moment. For me and for Elena. Guilt pricked at me. Mum rarely insisted like this. Okay, Mum, I relented. Okay, I'll look at it soon. Thank you, dear. Love you. Love you too, Mum. After hanging up, I sat there for a moment. Grandma Elena. She had been quiet, kind, and seemed perfectly content with her simple, traditional life. What could possibly be in that box that mattered so much now? It felt like holding on to clutter, something my practical side hated. this time. I pushed myself off the sofa and walked to the hall closet. Tucked behind the vacuum cleaner and some old coats was the cardboard box, sealed with aging tape and labelled Elena, personal, in Mum's handwriting. Dust puffed up as I pulled it out. It wasn't very big, but it felt heavy with obligation. I carried it into the living room and set it down on the floor, creating a small island of dust and history in my otherwise spotless space. Part of me wanted to just shove it back in the closet, but I promised Mom, fine, I'd get it over with. I cut the tape and opened the flaps. The smell of old paper, dried lavender, and time filled the air. On top lay a few neatly folded scarves, their patterns faded. Beneath them, some old photographs in black and white, people I vaguely recognised from Mum's stories. There were letters tied with ribbon, a worn recipe book, and a pair of spectacles. It was exactly what I expected. Sentimental items, things important to Grandma, perhaps, but just old things to me. I started making piles. Keep for Mum, maybe donate, discard. My movements were efficient, detached. I just wanted the task done. My fingers brushed against something hard near the bottom. I pushed aside a small stack of embroidered handkerchiefs and saw it. A small plain wooden box. It wasn't fancy. The wood was dark and smooth with age, maybe slightly scratched. It looked quite ordinary, maybe something she'd kept buttons or pins in. I picked it up. It was surprisingly light, probably empty, I thought. Just another container taking up space. My hand hovered over the donation pile. It was just clutter, wasn't it? Another piece of the past I didn't have room for in my tidy modern life. I almost let it drop. For some reason, I didn't drop the little wooden box into the donation pile. Maybe it was Mum's voice in my head, that gentle insistence that Grandma Elena kept things carefully. Or maybe it was just easier in that moment of indecision to set it aside rather than make a final choice. I finished sorting the rest of the cardboard box quickly, putting the scarves and recipe book into a bag for Mum, discarding a few truly worn-out items and packing the old photos carefully back inside. Then I pushed the main cardboard box back into the closet, relieved to have it out of sight. But the small wooden box, I placed it on my coffee table. It sat there for 3 days, a dark little rectangle interrupting the clean lines of my living room. Every time my eyes landed on it, I felt a small prickle of annoyance. It was out of place. It represented an unfinished task. It was clutter. My tidy apartment felt slightly less tidy just by its presence. Why was I even keeping it? It was probably empty, or held something useless like old buttons. This was illogical. On the third evening, while I was heating up leftovers for dinner, Mum called again. We talked about her week, about my work, the usual things. Then, inevitably, she asked, "Did you get a chance to look through Eleanor's box, dear?" I stirred my pasta, perhaps a little too vigorously. "Most of it, Mum," I admitted. There wasn't much. Some scarves, photos. Oh, and a little wooden box. It's probably empty though. Looks quite plain. I tried to sound casual, hoping she wouldn't press further. There was a pause. When Mum spoke again, her voice was softer, tinged with something I couldn't quite identify. Maybe sadness. Empty. Oh, well, your grandmother kept things for reasons, Maya. Even plain things sometimes held meaning for her. Maybe just look a little closer when you have time. No rush, dear. Her words lingered after we hung up. Kept things for reasons. The guilt returned, mixed with frustration. Why did I feel responsible for understanding the hidden meanings behind my grandmother's simple possessions? I needed space in my apartment, space in my head. Dealing with the past felt like a burden when the present was already so demanding. Later that night, I couldn't settle down. The television droned on, but I wasn't watching. My usual phone scrolling felt unsatisfying. I felt restless, stuck. My gaze drifted back to the wooden box on the coffee table. It seemed to silently reproach me for my impatience. Fine. Okay. I would look closer, just to prove to myself, and maybe Mom, that it was nothing important. Then I could finally decide what to do with it. I picked it up. It felt smooth in my hands. The wood warm pleasant by time. Running my fingers along the side, I felt something I hadn't noticed in my quick glance before. Faint lines, patterns, almost completely smoothed away by years of handling. I tilted the box under the lamplight. Yes, definitely carvings. They looked like leaves or vines, intricately done once, though now barely visible. That was interesting. Grandma Elena, with her plain dresses and quiet ways, didn't seem like someone who would own something with delicate carvings. My practical resolve softened just a tiny bit, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. It wasn't logical to ignore a detail like that. What if it wasn't just a button box? I slid my thumbnail under the lid and lifted it. The inside was lined with faded, dark velvet. Resting on the lining were just three things. A few brittle dried flowers, maybe violets, tied with a thin faded blue ribbon, and a small silver locket, tarnished with age. My first thought was disappointment. See, just sentimental trinkets. Exactly what I expected. Meaningful to her, perhaps, but not to me. Clutter confirmed. I reached in to lift the items out, planning to put them in the bag for Mom. The dried flowers crumbled slightly at my touch. The ribbon felt fragile. Then I picked up the silver locket, and I paused. It felt surprisingly heavy in my palm, heavier than such a small tarnished piece of silver should feel. I turned it over. It was oval-shaped, completely plain on the outside, no engravings or markings visible through the tarnish. Why was it so heavy? My rational mind kicked in again. Was it solid silver? Was there something dense inside? Suddenly the locket wasn't just another piece of sentimental junk. It was a small puzzle. The annoyance I'd felt towards the box started to fade, replaced by a genuine question. What was inside this unexpectedly heavy locket? I examined the side, looking for the clasp. It was tiny, almost hidden. Using my fingernail, I tried to pry it open. It was stiff, resisting my efforts. The tiny clasp on the silver locket refused to budge. I pressed it with my thumbnail, tried wiggling it side to side, even attempted using the edge of a coin from my purse, but it remained stubbornly shut. Frustration began to bubble up again, mixing with the curiosity that had taken hold. Part of me wanted to just toss the locket back into the wooden box and forget about it. It was probably just an old baby picture inside, maybe of my mum or an uncle. Why was I wasting my time? But another part, the logical, questioning part, wouldn't let it go. Why was it so heavy? Why was the glass so resistant, as if it hadn't been opened in decades? And Mum's words echoed again. Your grandmother kept things for reasons. Elena wasn't frivolous. If she kept this locket hidden away in this specific box, there had to be a purpose. My annoyance shifted into determination. I wasn't going to be defeated by a tiny piece of metal. I carried the locket into the kitchen, thinking maybe a little leverage would help. I carefully gripped the main body of the locket with a pair of small pliers from my utility drawer, protecting the silver with a fold of paper towel. Then, holding my breath, I used my thumbnail one more time, applying firm, steady pressure right on the release point of the clasp. For a second, nothing happened. I almost gave up, thinking I might break it. Then, with a faint but distinct click, the locket sprang open. Success! I quickly put the pliers down and held the locket eagerly. I expected to see a faded miniature photograph, perhaps of a younger Grandma Elena, or even my grandfather, but there was no picture. Instead, nestled snugly inside one half of the oval, was a tiny square piece of paper, folded over many times until it was barely bigger than my fingernail. My heart gave an unexpected thump. This was definitely not what I had anticipated. My fingers trembled slightly as I carefully worked the folded paper out of the locket. It was old, yellowed, and felt incredibly fragile. I carried it back to the living room, placing it gently on the coffee table under the lamplight. With painstaking care, I began to unfold it. Each crease seemed delicate, threatening to tear. As the paper opened up, I saw handwriting. It wasn't just any handwriting. It was the familiar, elegant, slightly slanted script I recognized instantly as my grandmother Eleanor's. I'd seen it on birthday cards and the labels she put on jars of jam, but this wasn't a simple greeting. The note read, "My dearest granddaughter, if you find this, know that dreams don't fade with age. Find joy in creating. The real gift is the courage to start. Look under the lining." I read it once, then twice. A strange mix of confusion and emotion washed over me. Dreams don't fade with age. Find joy in creating. This didn't sound like the quiet, practical grandmother I remembered, the one who seemed content with knitting and gardening. And what did she mean by the real gift? And look under the lining. The lining of what? My eyes darted back to the open wooden box still sitting on the coffee table, the dried flowers and ribbon lying beside it. Look under the lining. Suddenly it clicked. The box's lining. I picked up the wooden box again, my earlier annoyance completely gone, replaced now by an urgent sense of intrigue. I ran my fingers over the faded velvet inside. It seemed ordinary, glued down securely at the edges, but Eleanor's note was specific. I pressed gently around the bottom. Near one corner, my finger detected a slight unevenness, a subtle bump that didn't feel like solid wood underneath. My pulse quickened. Holding the box steady, I carefully slipped my fingernail under the edge of the velvet lining, right near that bump. It resisted for a moment. Then I felt the old glue give way slightly. Encouraged, I gently pulled. The velvet began to lift, revealing not the dark wood of the box's bottom, but another layer, a thin, false bottom made of the same wood. My breath caught in my throat. With the lining peeled back, I could see the faint outline of this hidden compartment. I carefully inserted my fingernail into a tiny gap and lifted the false bottom. It came up easily, and there, nestled in the secret space beneath, lay two objects that made me gasp. One was a beautiful, old-fashioned fountain pen with a dark, polished barrel and hints of gold on the nib and clip. It looked elegant, sophisticated, and completely unexpected. Beside it lay a small leather-bound notebook, its cover worn smooth with handling. It looked like a journal. I stared, completely stunned. A fountain pen, a notebook filled with... what? My grandmother, the quiet Elena I thought I knew, had a secret compartment in her plain wooden box, hiding a fancy pen and a private journal. I never, ever knew she wrote anything beyond letters or recipes. A wave of questions flooded my mind, but overriding them all was a profound sense of wonder. Who was my grandmother, really? I reached into the hidden compartment and carefully lifted out the leather-bound notebook. It felt soft and important in my hands. This, I suspected, was connected to the joy in creating Elena had written about in her note. This felt like the real discovery. Clutching the small, leather-bound notebook, I sat back down on the sofa, the fountain pen resting beside me on the cushion. My living room felt different now, charged with a quiet energy. The television had long since gone dark, unnoticed. The world outside my window seemed distant. All my focus was on the worn little book in my hands. For a moment, I just held it, tracing the soft indentation on the cover with my fingertip. It felt incredibly personal, like holding a secret whispered across time. Was I invading her privacy? But then I remembered the note in the locket. If you find this, she had intended for it to be found, perhaps specifically by me. Taking a deep breath, I opened the notebook. The pages were filled, edge to edge, with the same elegant, slightly slanted handwriting I'd seen on the tiny note. Ink, faded from black to a soft brown in places, formed words that flowed across the paper. It wasn't a diary of daily events, not exactly. It was filled with poems, short, thoughtful poems about the changing seasons, the feeling of sunlight through a window, the quiet satisfaction of a task well done. There were fragments of stories too, observations about people she might have seen, imagined dialogues, descriptions of places maybe only she knew. I started reading, slowly at first, then more quickly as I was drawn in. This was Elena, my grandmother, but a version I had never imagined. The quiet woman I remembered, who always seemed content with her routine, had possessed this rich inner world filled with reflection, imagination, and a clear love for language. Some entries spoke of doubts, of dreams quietly held, of the small frustrations and joys of everyday life. I read about her watching birds from her kitchen window, wondering about their journeys. I read a short poem about the colour of the sky just before a storm. I even found a passage where she wrote about feeling shy, sharing her thoughts, tucking them away like hidden treasures. A wave of emotion washed over me. Surprise, sadness, that I never knew this side of her, but mostly a profound sense of connection. Her words weren't grand or dramatic. They were thoughtful, honest, and surprisingly relatable. Her quiet hopes and hidden creative spark resonated deeply with the vague dissatisfaction and unspoken dreams I carried within myself. The feeling of being stuck in a routine, the desire for something more meaningful. It seemed she might have understood that too. I finally understood the note in the locket. Dreams don't fade with age. Find joy in creating. The real gift is the courage to start. The gift wasn't just the pen or the notebook. It wasn't even the poems themselves. The real gift was the revelation. The knowledge that my quiet grandmother had nurtured a secret passion, that she had found joy in expressing herself, even if only in private. The gift was her unspoken encouragement, reaching out from the past to tell me it was okay to have dreams, and that the most important step was simply beginning. The courage wasn't necessarily in being published or famous, but in the simple act of creating for oneself. Hours seemed to pass as I sat there, lost in her world. When I finally closed the notebook, the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through my window blinds. I looked at the items spread out on my coffee table. The wooden box with its faint carvings, the tarnished silver locket, the elegant fountain pen, and the precious notebook. They were no longer clutter. They were pieces of a puzzle, fragments of a legacy, sources of unexpected inspiration. Carefully, I gathered them up. I found a soft cloth and gently wiped the dust from the wooden box, polished the silver locket until it gleamed softly, and admired the craftsmanship of the pen. I placed them not back in a closet or in a donation pile, but on the corner of my small desk, the desk where I usually just paid bills or sorted mail. Now it felt like a space with potential. These objects weren't just links to the past, they felt like permission for the future. I felt lighter, less alone. The vague dissatisfaction hadn't vanished entirely, but it was now mixed with a sense of hope and purpose. I picked up my phone, my fingers dialing my mother's number before I even consciously decided to. She answered on the second ring, her voice slightly sleepy. "Maya, is everything all right, dear?" "Mum," I began, my voice thick with emotion. "Mum, you were right. About Grandma Elena. About the box." I told her everything. The locket, the note, the hidden compartment, the pen, and the notebook filled with poems and stories. I described the feeling of discovering this secret side of the woman we both thought we knew so well. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then I heard Mom inhale sharply. "Oh, Maya," she whispered, her voice filled with tears. "Poems, stories. I never knew. All those years. She kept that hidden." We talked for a long time, sharing memories of Elena, piecing together this new image of her, feeling a renewed connection to her and to each other through this shared discovery. It was a tearful, beautiful, heartfelt conversation that left us both feeling closer to the grandmother we missed. After hanging up, I looked again at the items on my desk. Grandma Eleanor's message was clear. Find joy in creating. The real gift is the courage to start. That afternoon, I went out and bought myself a new notebook, a simple one with blank pages and a smooth writing pen. I didn't know exactly what I would write yet. Maybe just observations, thoughts, maybe fragments of ideas like Eleanor's. But, inspired by her quiet courage, I knew I was ready to start. The gift from the past wasn't just a story discovered, it was an invitation to write my